Everybody, welcome back. I'm Stratch Professor, and today we're going to look at my pre-release tier list for Total War Warhammer 3. So as always, if you enjoy the content, please be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out a ton on the channel. Check out a lot of the Warhammer content I'm going to release. I'm going to start just flooding the channel with tons and tons of content. I'll have, guides for each faction eventually. I'm going to be doing multiple playthroughs. Right now I'm doing Nurgle, Slaanesh, and I'm probably going to add on the Ogres very soon. I think that Black Falcon wanted to see some Kislev as well. So we're going to be doing 2 or 3 campaigns at the same time, and then we're going to have guides about all kinds of different aspects of the game. So this is going to be, like I said, a tier list, an overview, which is really hard to do for the game just because I think that every faction can be fun, it can be interesting, but I know people love tier lists, and there are a lot of other tier lists out there that are popping up, and I disagree with quite a lot of what they say, especially at the top end. So I want to go ahead and add my little bit in there. So what I've decided to do is I've got basically a standardized tier list here with some caveats. I'm only going to talk about what I think is the strongest lord for each faction. I'm not going to go into each individual lord too much just for the sake of time. This tier list also does not include Chaos Demons Undivided, but I didn't want to load up my own icons and stuff like that to fix it. So they would be in the same row as Tzeench, basically. And then I did a much more extensive tier list over here where I rated each faction based on 4 different qualities. So one is combat, how efficient, how strong is the faction in combat, how strong is it on the campaign map, how challenging is the faction, and then how much fun is the faction, which is obviously pretty subjective, but I went ahead and put a few things up here that I'm thinking about, and there are some other things as well, but these are the major things I'm thinking about with these ratings, and then I gave each faction a 1 to 5 rating, 5 being the strongest, 1 being, really weak. And so with combat, I'm looking at the overall unit power, how strong are a lot of their units that they're going to be using, what are some of the different buffs and debuffs they can use both in the battle and outside of the battle that could affect the battle. So different things on the campaign map, different buildings, technologies, lord skills, things like that can buff them up in the battle itself. Magic, how strong is their magic? And then the overall cost of the units. How efficient are your units, right? So can you fight really well for a low gold cost, or do you have to invest a huge amount of money in an army to be able to fight well? You've got the campaign management. So any kind of upkeep reduction on key units that are very strong is really, really good. And I should say that, I should preface this, that I'm primarily looking at this in terms of legendary, right? So legendary campaign difficulty, very hard battles. So if you play on a lower difficulty level, then some of this might change. Like the upkeep, stuff may not matter as much because you're not going to be as stressed in terms of money on legendary. But these are things that I think are important. Control, so how much public order do you have in an area? Because if a faction has low public order, then it's very difficult to expand and gain a lot of property quickly, because you're going to have to backtrack and deal with rebellions a lot. So that can be annoying. Growth, how fast does the faction grow? How quickly can you get to your tier 3 and tier 4 units? How strong are your units at the tier 3 and tier 4 level you can hire? Your influence, so how strong is your diplomacy? How strong are other things that you can do to kind of control events around you on the map? And then any sorts of buffs or debuffs that you have. How is your movement speed on the map? How are different, kinds of buffs that you can get in terms of these other things? Upkeep, reduction, control, growth, all that kind of thing. The challenge, we're looking at the macro, micro, so how difficult is it to manage your army in combat? How difficult is it to manage the choices on the campaign map? Your geography, so thinking about your start position, thinking about the kinds of places that you can occupy and that you can't occupy easily. How many hostiles are you going to be facing in the early game? And your punishment, how difficult is it for you to recover from mistakes? Do you have really high replenishment so your army can recover? Are you a very good defensive faction? So if you have to fall back, you're not going to get run over. If you make a couple of misclicks in a fight or misuse a spell or something like that, is it going to be okay? Can you still recover? And then how much fun is it? And again, this is going to be the most subjective one, but I'm looking at uniqueness. How different is this faction from other Total War factions, and specifically Total War Warhammer 3 factions? What about the theme and the lore? Is it fun? Is it interesting? Is it something fresh? Are the voice lines interesting? Are the events interesting or amusing in some ways? what's kind of the fantasy? Are they living up to that fantasy? Is it allowing you to, you know, just sort of get immersed in the game? And then the replayability is how likely would someone be to want to play this again? Are there different choices or different strategies you could use to play out a campaign in a different way and keep it fresh? Okay, so with all that out of the way, I'm going to talk about each faction. Then I've got the game queued up here, so I'm going to pull it up and just look at some basic stuff kind of as I talk about it here. So we're going to be bouncing back and forth between a couple of different screens. But my number one faction, I think, is Kugath. So I think it's Nurgle. And I know that Legend of Total War, I believe, thinks that Nurgle is the worst faction. So this is one where I differ from him on like the most extreme level. And I think a lot of other people really hate on Nurgle as well. And it's not just that they don't like to play Nurgle. I believe they have actually articulated they think Nurgle is objectively a weaker faction than many of the other factions. And a lot of this, I think, is due to misinformation and not understanding just how powerful some of these buffs are in conjunction with specific units that Nurgle's able to field. So Nurgle has really high resilience, some of the highest resilience of any faction in the game. It is really, really difficult to kill a properly prepared Nurgle army. All of them are going to get +9 melee defense. I'll go ahead and pull some of this up here so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So let me go ahead and we'll move this screen over here, and I'll pull it back up in just a moment. But let's go ahead and just pull up Nurgle, and then I'll just kind of show you what I'm talking about. As far as the campaign quality, while we're here, he has very, very good campaign quality. So you get 40% starting health for Nurglings. We'll talk about that in a second, but that is really good. It basically means you can hire Nurglings at pretty close to full health anytime, anywhere on the map. So you almost always get to just spam these, what I think are the most cost-efficient units in the whole game, perhaps, anytime, anywhere, to help you defend, to help you reinforce an army after a tough fight, if you're going to fight consecutive battles. Just extremely strong. It's almost like a raised dead globally for these things, if you're familiar with the vampire counts. Infection cost is cheap, corruption is very good, and then spreading plague is good. But as we fire this up, I'll talk a little bit more about Nurgle, and then I'll show you what I'm talking about with a couple of things on the map. So they have huge resilience, they have really high HP pools, they have really high melee defense on pretty much all of their units. They have several debuffs that can lower the amount of damage that the enemy's doing. So this is one critique that Nurgle gets a lot. Is like, oh, they have no defense against ranged units. How are they ever supposed to beat archers? Well, there's a play you can put on enemy factions that will give them minus 20% range damage. So it's basically like you're giving everything in your army 20% missile resist. And they naturally have 20% physical damage resist. And you can put a plague on your own army that's going to give your units an additional 20% physical resist. So now you're talking about units that have a really high HP pool that also have 40% physical resist and effectively 20% missile resist, and they all have extremely high melee defense. Hopefully it doesn't bug out on us here. Okay, there we go. Usually aren't that many bugs, but occasionally you see some. So that is profoundly powerful. And on top of that, they have really high, really strong magic with the Nurgle magic. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. So these little things don't seem like much, right? But look at this. 8,400 health on a unit that's only 87 gold, less than 100 gold. The thing's got the 20% physical resist, as all demons do. They've got this cloud of flies for 9 melee defense. So they're already starting off with like 33 melee defense. And Kugath, specifically, you can get double regeneration on these things. So when he's close to them, he naturally is going to give them regeneration over time, and then they can get actual regeneration as an ability with Kugath, and you can cast a spell on them, this overcasted Nurgle magic, that's effectively going to get heal them for like 60% of their max health or something. This Fleshy Abundance is insanely powerful. It is expensive at 25%, but it's 20 seconds of 1.6 each. So I don't know the exact math on that, but I think it's something like 32% of their max health damage. And that's in an area of effect 35 meters. And there's no cap. You can hit all 20 of your units with this if everyone's bunched up, which is how you want to operate as Nurgle most of the time. So you basically heal your entire army for 32%. So they are extremely, extremely difficult to kill. It's not as easy as just drop a bunch of ammo on them, right? Just empty your quiver and Nurgle's just going to fall. They're not. They're very, very durable. So they have extremely cost-efficient units with the Nurglings. People say, oh, those plague bearers are slow. It's like, yeah, they're slow. It's not going to matter. Like, you're not going to be able to kill these things. I'm telling you. I've fought so many battles with Nurgle with, like, not that much more than this. When you get all the cost reductions and savings, like a 2,500 gold army, like, sieging tier 5 towns, right? Like, taking on 5,000 gold armies and very easily beating those things. So it can be done. But the thing that really kind of sets them apart, and this is for combat and campaign, are these plagues. People really don't understand just how you should optimize this. Be sure to watch my Nurgle guide and watch my Nurgle campaign if you want to see how this works. But a lot of these plagues, it is a little weird because some of them seem sort of random, but there are certain combinations you can get with these things to be very, very strong. So one that's really good against the enemy is you can do Palsy, which is going to give them -4 melee attack. Then you can give them 15% weapon damage reduction if you want. So keep in mind that you're poisoning everybody with most Nurgle units as well. That's another thing that I didn't mention there, is that is going to lower their damage by 15%. So now, again, with one of these plagues I mentioned before, you can have 40% physical resist. You can debuff the enemy by 20% on their missiles, right? So that's going to be effectively 60% damage reduction. And with the poison, then you're going to be able to lower it an additional 15%. So that's 75% damage reduction on these units. And some of them can actually get armor as well, which, you know, could come into play if it's not armor-piercing damage. And that's where these missiles of the Soul Grinders come in, is they also apply that poison, which is going to lower the amount of damage they do, that the enemy does with their missile units. So it's an extreme amount of durability. So you can do Palsy, weapon damage reduction, missile strength reduction. Boom. There you go. That's going to hurt them a lot. And then some people say, oh, well, Nurgle doesn't have any armor-piercing damage. How are they supposed to get through heavily armored things? First of all, it's not going to matter, because if it's a long fight, you have so much regeneration anyways. They're not going to be able to kill you, so you're just going to beat them over time naturally. But if you are really worried about armor resist, boom, lower the armor by 40% on their entire army permanently for a fight. And all you have to do is just summon a cultist, just pick out whichever plague you want. Alright, I want this one, I want that one, I want that one. Unlocked, so you can pick one main plague and 2 symptoms, and then just do summon cultist, and you can just walk this thing around with you. And if there's going to be a tough fight, boom, just debuff the enemy and you're good to go. So you can put the debuff on the enemy. You can also put huge buffs on yourself, these special things on yourself. So the one that I mentioned before, the 20% physical resist, you can put that on you, and then it's going to give you some other buffs as well. The most notable is probably this constant vomiting, which is going to allow you to summon 2 free plague bearers with no magic, no nothing. You just get to summon those up. So that's going to be really strong. And then one of the best ones that I've kind of figured out playing through the Nurgle campaign is this Crumbling Egg. It's going to be really, really good because it gives you 35% replenishment. 35% on top of just the normal replenishment you can get. That means after you win a fight, all of your units are going to be full health again. You can basically globally summon units anywhere, whenever you want, and they're going to be full health in one turn. You can even dash and globally summon units with Nurgle. So it's just an insane amount of uptime on your armies. You never have to sit around and wait on, hiring armies. You can literally hire, 17 units on the spot. You lose a tough battle, or it's 50-50 or something like that, boom, your army is completely refilled and ready to go the next turn. It's insane. It's so good. I cannot believe that people think Nurgle is the worst army. If anything, they're borderline OP. So that replenishment is absolutely huge. And then if on your army as well, it's going to give you Mucus Run, which is Vanguard. That's another critique I've had people say, oh, Nurgle doesn't have any Vanguard units. They're so slow. It's like you can give your entire army Vanguard with the most powerful plague that also gives you massive replenishment. And it's going to have egg on it, so if it spreads over to the enemy while you're wearing this, they're going to take attrition, which is not very much on legendary, but they're going to have minus 25% campaign movement. That means they can't run away from you. So yeah, it's really, really good, the different kinds of plagues. And you have other stuff you can do with these plagues that's good as well. So this one right here, in terms of money, you get big money off of this. Some of these towns I've sacked before will give you 30,000 gold or something on a sack if you wear this plague, plus 250% sack bonus, especially some of those Tzeench towns. So you can just make insane money late game by putting this plague on your army and sacking, you know, a tier 4, tier 5 town. So, you know, by turn 60 in the campaign, I'm fielding 5 different armies and fighting on 5 different fronts at the same time on legendary. Like, that's how efficient their units are in terms of the cheapness and just how much power you can get out of the plagues, because a lot of them have a ton of Nurglings in it, which are super cheap but very effective, especially with the plagues. But it just goes to show just how much money they can rack up and just how efficient these armies can be. So, extremely powerful. Especially with those plagues. And another thing that I'll bring up here is just how fast you can get the grinders. And people really, really underestimate this with Nurgle, because with most faction, the grinders are tier 5, and it's going to take you like 100 turns or something to get to tier 5. With Nurgle, you can start getting grinders before turn 30. Easily. So here's how it works. This is a basic military building. Okay, that's key for some of the other buffs that I'll get into here. And I don't want to spend too long on Nurgle, but it is my number 1 pick, and it is, I think, the most misunderstood faction, so I do want to spend quite a bit of time on it. Get this building, okay? So it's going to give you Forsaken early on, which aren't insane, but they're okay. They're actually sort of fast for Nurgle for 42, and they have high armor, so they can go chase after archer units pretty well. You get a ton of those. Chaos Spawn are actually pretty good as well. They're actually quite resilient with Nurgle because they get that plus 9 melee defense. They end up with 37 melee defense. And remember, you can regenerate them a ton as well. They're going to be reasonably fast. They're unbreakable. They can help you knock down doors. So these are very good. And then you get over here to the Soul Grinder. Now, if you notice, this says that your building only has to be tier 3 to unlock the cycle. So to have it go from here to here is only tier 3, which means you can get Soul Grinders at tier 3. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but you got to cycle through. You're only going to be able to get a Soul Grinder every, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like every 21 turns you can get 1 Soul Grinder, right? Like, maybe that's not that good. However, keep in mind, this is basic military. There's a technology you can get that's going to lower the cycle time on the Rancid Aloe building. So that's going to lower you down to 3 turns per. So that's going to take it down to every 15 turns you get 1. And then you can also get a plague that lowers basic military time, right? So cycle time on military buildings right there, -1. Okay, so that's going to take it down to every 10 turns. You can get a Soul Grinder. And then there's actually another building you can get, a utility building over here, that can lower it by an additional turn every time, -1 for basic military buildings, right? And if you get that in a tier 4 building, which usually you're not going to have that, but if you do, this one's actually, no, that one's -1. If you get all the way up there, then it's -2. Now, it can't go down to 0, but in other words, you can very comfortably get the cycle time on this down to 2 turns per cycle, and sometimes even as low as 1 turn. And because it only requires tier 3 to get to this, that means you can put it in all of your secondary towns. So your main garrison here, if you set this up right, each one of these towns you can eventually build up to tier 3, and then just throw down this building, throw down the military building, throw the plague on your things, and then every like 6 turns or so per town, you're going to be able to get a Soul Grinder, right? So every 6 turns, you're going to get 4 Soul Grinders in your pool, potentially. That's like the best case scenario. But you're going to be getting a lot of Soul Grinders very regularly, and you can get to that before turn 30 easily. Nurgle also has extremely high growth, so you can level up a bunch of this stuff hugely. In fact, there's a plague you can get that increases the growth by 75. It's Green Pox, I believe. Yeah, right here. So it says 50, but then one of the components gives you another 25. So that's 75 per town that has this plague in your province. right? So 4 times 75, that's 300 growth, not including everything else that you have. So you can grow up tremendously fast and get that Soul Grinder engine running. And while you're getting the Soul Grinders, you're also getting Forsaken. You're also getting Chaos Spawn. And then you just throw a hell of a lot of Nurglings in an army as well. You know, if you're really ritzy, if you're really rolling in the money, you can put some Plague Bears in there instead of the Nurglings. But that's just insanely powerful. You get a lot of those things. And the Soul Grinders fix many of the problems that people complain about. They're ranged. They completely tear up enemy archers because they outrange them. They have huge spread damage. They have physical resist. And then they can get in there and fight as well. So they've got 42 melee attack and effectively 42 melee defense and 90 armor. And you can replenish them as well. They have heavy armor-piercing damage. They have magical ammunition, magical attacks, and they have that poison, so it's going to lower the archer damage by 15%. So they're just incredibly strong. And they're very fast. They're 75 speed. So they're just everything that people think is bad for Nurgle. The Soul Grinders have it covered. So, again, I think even if you don't have the Soul Grinders, your army is still exceptionally powerful for the reasons I described. But definitely once you get those, it's just off the charts. And they're going to get it so much faster. And they're going to get so many more. Because remember, you can hire them anywhere, anytime. You know, with other factions, maybe you get up to tier 5 by, you know, turn 100, but then you have to globally recruit the Soul Grinders, and I haven't gotten them with other factions yet, because it takes so long, but it's probably a 2 or 3 turn unit, and so if you want to global that in, that's going to be 4 to 6 turns to have to get some Soul Grinders over in your army, and it's going to be insanely expensive. So, unlike, you know, Nurgle, who can just summon them up and be ready to go anywhere, anytime. So, I just think he's insanely powerful. He has huge buffs, huge debuffs. His magic is crazy. You know, just that healing alone is nuts. But then you also have a pretty good wind spell in that tree. And a pretty decent AoE spell as well. Explosion spell. Fast Soul Grinders. You spread corruption insanely fast. A lot of those plagues are going to put like 6 corruption enemy provinces per plague. So if you have 3 plagues in their province, it's like 18 corruption a turn, not including your characters. So the places are going to be corrupt almost instantly, which means you're going to have really strong public order in those areas. They're going to be taking attrition in those areas. You're going to get high growth in those areas, which is going to allow you to build them up. And then once your towns are a higher level, they're going to have better garrisons. It's going to be more difficult for the enemy to retake those towns. So corruption is just insanely important. You have mass replenishment, like I mentioned. That one plague that I find myself using the most is 35%, not including what you get from your lord skills or your technologies or whatever. So that's huge. 1 turn global recruitment. Anytime, anywhere. You can even do it in dash stance, like I mentioned before. You have plagues for every situation, whether you need to grow a town, debuff an enemy, or whatever. Another crazy thing that I hadn't even thought about that I did on accident was one of these plagues. I think it was the growth one that I put on my own town. I think it's green pox, brain frog, and paroxysm. Yeah, this right here. I mean, this is borderline like cheese hacking, right? I didn't even intend to do this in one of the campaigns. I was just putting this on my towns just to get the extra growth, but then it spread over and it ended up bouncing into this place and then bouncing over to Tzeench. And I'd been fighting this Tzeench faction for a while, but they had that green pox on all of their towns. Well, look what it says. -2 local recruitment capacity. I thought they were out of money or something because they never hired another army to come get me. But you know what happened? They got a plague that was lasting like 12 turns in all of their provinces. -8 local recruitment capacity in their town. You know what that means? They literally can't recruit anything. They can't build an army because they had -8 local recruitment. So they actually could not hire anything out of there. So it was just a lord sitting in their town doing nothing for like 10 turns before I came over and killed him. And I was confused because, again, I was just thinking, why the hell aren't they building another 20 stack and coming at me? But I was fighting like 4 different wars at the same time, and then I figured it out. I was like, oh my god, that is disgusting. Like, that's so good. So yeah, there's just like an insane amount of different like nonsense you can do on the campaign map with Nurgle, and it's really, really hard for the enemy to deal with that. Sometimes they can get some buildings that like reduce your plague spread chance or something, but it's not gonna matter. You can crank it up so high, like you can make it almost 100% that different plagues are gonna spread through, you know, different technologies and buildings you can get. So anyways, Nurgle super, super strong faction. So I think he's pretty challenging. The combat is simple. You kind of just blob everything up for the most part and just run at him. You do have some spells you can cast, which are cool. You can kind of flank around a little bit with some of your units. You need to micro your grinders and stuff like that. But the combat's relatively simple compared to a couple of the other factions out there. But it's all about which plagues you're choosing, because you can only cast 2 plagues per turn, and early game especially it can be kind of expensive in terms of infections. So you have to budget that really well. You have to protect your towns, especially early. It's really expensive to have to rebuild a town. Your very entry-level military buildings are like 5,000 gold, and some of the other Chaos factions are only like 900 gold. So it really, really sucks if you get sacked early on. So you need to be very careful with that. And then there's a lot of aggro. People hate you because they do not like having plagues on their property. And you get very strong very quickly as Nurgle if you play it correctly. And so you can have like a 4 or 5 front war where you've got the ogres from the mountains coming at you, you got Tzeench, from the west coming at you, you got people from the Darklands coming at you from the east, you have Kislev and all of those people coming at you from the south. So there's just fights going on everywhere, and just figuring out how you want to manage that can be somewhat challenging. I think they're a lot of fun. I think the plague system is very interesting. It's very unique. There are a ton of different options. You get to have a whole bunch of multi-front wars. You can afford to field multiple armies, which I think is really cool. You can be hyper-aggressive on Nurgle. And there's quite a bit of macro, which I think is interesting. So again, figuring out how you're going to use the plagues, all that. And I think it's pretty fun that they're like this cheerful, death, but also bringing life to the world type of thing. So I think it's a pretty cool theme fantasy. Okay. And we'll speed it up a little bit here, but I just wanted to spend some time on my boy Nurgle there because it's just really, really, shockingly misunderstood, even by high-level players, what the potential of that faction is in campaign. I don't know about multiplayer, but it's just, really strong in campaign. I can't emphasize that enough. Okay, so Nakari gets minus 20 diplomat, or plus 20 with all factions. You get some tribute money, experience, seduce. So I'll show you a couple of things here, and again, we'll speed it up, so I don't want this to be super, super long. But I will spend most of my time probably on the top 2 or 3 factions, and then we'll talk about the others, because that's what I've spent the most time with. I haven't played a campaign all the way through with most of the factions at this point. I've just kind of scouted them out, and I've played against them. So I kind of have a sense of it, but I'm sure there are lots of things to explore. I hope so, and lots of things to learn as I play those factions. But Slaanesh... So, I think he is extremely strong, but his strength might be annoying for some people to have to manage. So that's one of the main reasons. I mean, on just a strictly power level in terms of the campaign map especially, you could make an argument that he's number 1 with just how much he can control what's going on. I still think Nurgle could give him a run for his money, but he's definitely up there. In terms of overall power. So what makes him particularly strong then? Let me pull up the chart here. Okay. So he has very powerful units in general. So his units do a lot of damage, specifically a lot of armor piercing damage. They're very fast. So you can run around and get easy flanks, particularly in the open field. They can completely wipe people out. They do have some buffs and some magic. I'm gonna say, let's say average magic, maybe above average magic, because your Slaanesh magic is not that great, but you do have access to Lord of Shadows, which is pretty good. So yeah, you're very fast, very good at flanking, really good at picking off individual units or dueling lords and killing them quickly. You are pretty bad if you do not get flanked, though, and there are a lot of bad units in your roster, so you have to emphasize the stronger units, and they're kind of similar to each other. So, for example, all the Marauders are pretty horrible. I wouldn't get those most of the time. Check out my guide, check out my playthrough to see why. Basically, they're just too slow for the style of army. The Demonettes are pretty good, and specifically the Exalted Demonettes of Slaanesh, if you can afford them, which you probably can, because you make a ton of money as Slaanesh. Are actually quite strong. They have really good melee attack, melee defense, huge armor piercing damage, and then every time somebody tries to run away, then they get extra melee attack and extra weapon damage. And they have devastating flanker, which means they get double charge bonus, pretty much, when they charge from the side or from the back. So they have like a 56 charge bonus. So they're very, very good. And then we've got the cavalry are really good in the fact that they are very fast. They do heavy, armor-piercing damage. They have the same kind of buffs. It's just they have low armor themselves and pretty low HP, so if they go against other anti-large, heavily armored things head-on in a charge, they're probably going to lose. So that's kind of rough. Another thing that's really underestimated about Slaanesh is that they have super high vigor loss reduction. Because they don't wear armor, they almost never get tired. And so you can run around and do these hit and runs and just get people to chase you around the map potentially, and they'll get tired. And what that does, it not only lowers the movement speed, but it lowers like their melee attack, their armor, their leadership. There's all sorts of debuffs they get when units get exhausted. And the fact that Slaanesh is so lightweight, they don't get exhausted very quickly. So in longer fights, if you can just keep moving, then you can use that vigor to your advantage. But yeah, they have strong cav as long as you're positioning them correctly. Chariots are pretty garbage, so I wouldn't get those most of the time. And then eventually you might be able to get some of these fiends. They're okay. I'm not sure, honestly, if they're that much better than the cavalry, right? They don't have that special buff whenever something is running away where they get extra things. They have, kind of low armor. Melee attack and leadership is kind of low. So these are all right, but I think most of the time I would probably just spam Exalted Demonettes of Slaanesh and Heartseekers. So their units are okay. Like, they're pretty good in combat. It's very high skill cap. You have to constantly move. One thing you can do on sieges, I've heard that they're not that good on sieges because they don't have that many siege attackers. They have spawns of Slaanesh, which are okay but not fantastic. But most of their other units aren't siege attackers. But what you can do is just run around the town, right? So line up all of your units on one side of the town and then just run as fast as possible around the circumference of the town all the way to the other side, and then you can knock down the door with just Nakari himself, takes it down pretty quickly. Or if it's an open ended town, you can just run in there and then run around and try to take as many different choke points as you can. And when their units start splitting up to try to cover those different choke points, that's where you find opportunities to intercept them and start picking them off in the town. So you have to have really high APM and macro or micro to do that correctly. Constantly moving different units around, taking different choke points, running away, picking units off, running away. It's a lot of movement. It's a lot of clicks. It's probably the most challenging combat style in the game, but it's really, really good if you can master it. But it can be difficult if they have a death stack of like heavily armored, very defensive units, and they're protecting, some really strong archers. That's a problem. And especially, if you don't take those choke points fast enough and they start throwing up barricades and towers and things like that, it can be a problem. So, anyways, their combat is good, albeit challenging. But the main thing that makes them strong is their campaign management. So they have really strong diplomacy. There are lots of different technologies you can get, skills you can get, racial things that we saw that you can get that allow you to get non-aggression packs, allow you to get defensive and military packs with different people. So you can kind of be almost everybody's friend just about that you want to, at least your neighbors. So other demons and different Norskin factions, you can get most of them to be your friend if you want to. So you don't really ever have to fight, and you have a very secure, probably the best starting position in the whole game, because it's in the very upper left corner of the map, so you can only be attacked on two sides. You can work with those factions with diplomacy a lot of times if you want to, or you can just kill them. They're relatively weak as well. Nurgle to your right, and then Nurgle can be a problem, but they're not going to use the campaign stuff I was talking about as well as a player would. And then you just have like the basic Warriors of Chaos just right below you that are easy to deal with in the early game. So anyways, early power. You have really high economy, so some of your main income buildings can give you like 400 gold in the early game if you keep your public order within a certain range. So right here, you can get 200 off of that, upgrade it, 300, upgrade it again to 400 per if you want. And then there are all kinds of different buffs you can get and events that can happen that give you extra money in your town. So it's not uncommon to have You know, like your starting town give you 2,500 to 3,000 gold per, and then most of your other towns you can do the same thing. And your buildings are super cheap. You spread corruption incredibly fast through a lot of your buildings and through the cults and all the heroes you can get. So it's easy to expand into new territories. And the name of the game that makes them unique, and why I think some people really like this and some people won't, is that you can spread cults around the map very easily through proliferate cults. And then each cult that you get, you can build a special cult building there that will give you another cultist. And then that cultist can build another cult, and then you can get a building there, and then you can build another cultist out of that, and then you can go start another cult. So it's really geometric, like just how fast you can completely paint the map pink with your different cults. You might be thinking, well, what's so important about those cults other than just making more cults? Well, with your heroes and some of the technologies you can get, you can keep spamming as much as you want, hinder replenishment on enemy lords, and they will get this mark of Slaanesh that ends up giving you a ton of devotees. So I've been getting like 1,700 devotees per turn or something like that, and what those allow you to do are, with each army, you're able to summon up a bonus army that doesn't cost anything. It's no gold, and sometimes you can get 15 or 16 units for free out of that. And there are other things you can do with your devotees as well, but that's a huge one, is that you basically get free armies every 5 turns if you want. And then you can sell some of those cult buildings as well. When you don't want to make any more cultists and you're about to attack a town, you can make another cult building that spawns basically a free devotee army. So you're just constantly spawning all these free armies, you know, on your lords, but then you can have the towns themselves start spawning these armies. So you just have an overwhelming amount of just free stuff just spewing out of everywhere, just armies everywhere. And you could just like overwhelm the world with force with all of these like cult devotee armies. That's very different from the Khorne armies, which cost you extra gold and you have to burn towns and you have to choose whether you want your skulls, whether you want your bonus army, or whether you want gold. You don't have to choose with Slaanesh. You just put it everywhere. So it's a lot of clicking with heroes, it's a lot of micromanagement, it's a lot of spamming towns. I think it's kind of fun to do it, but I will admit it can get a little tedious if you get to like 30 cultists or something like that. It can take a little while to click through those things, but that is, I think, the most optimal way to do it. So anyways, Slaanesh, very, very strong, but it has a very specific playstyle that's non-combat oriented. They do have really fun combat. I think some of the most fun combat out there, but a lot of what you're going to be doing is clicking with heroes. You don't have to do that style, but you are sacrificing a lot of power if you don't do that style. So that's something to keep in mind. So mass devotees, mass free armies, your cults are OP. It is sort of challenging just because of the combat is the most challenging in the game, but again, it's a very easy start position and your diplomacy is really overpowered. You know, you can choose when and where and who you fight almost any time. If you don't want to fight, people are not going to be able to get to you because you can get military alliances or vassalize a lot of the people around you. And so if an enemy wants to actually come and get you, they're going to have to run through all this like allied property where you're going to see them the whole time, and they're going to be meeting resistance, you know, from your military allies and your vassals. So they're really strong. That does allow you, if you are interested in trying to you know, test out some of the new alliance systems and recruit units from allies and things like that, that can give you some opportunities. That's been a little bit disappointing in my experience. Sometimes you can get some cool units if you can like vassalize a Cathay army, which I recommend. Check out my guide for that. I should probably release that tomorrow. But you do have the option of getting some cool units by doing that. So I think they are pretty fun. There's very skilled combat. There are lots of heroes. Their units are somewhat limited. Again, you're probably just going to be doing Exalted Demonettes and High Tier Cav. But they're pretty funny. A lot of their events I found pretty amusing, kind of a dark humor. It's just like this weird, like, freaky, sexualized, playful thing. You know, he's just like Nakari likes to frolic or something one time. So yeah, it's just like, man, this guy is just like really twisted. So he's a lot of fun. I think he's got a lot of personality to him. I think it's pretty fun. Some of the events that you get, some of the lore and stuff like that. So he's pretty cool. Okay, And then we have Scrag. Now, I haven't played through, and the Ogres are a little bit complex. They seem to play differently from a lot of other factions. But I probably will play through them pretty quickly. I do think that Scrag could be particularly strong and particularly fun. So he gets a lot of extra campaign movement range of 10%. He gets extra Butchers, which can be pretty strong. He gets Gorgers, which are a really good anti-infantry unit around tier 3, so you can get a lot of them pretty quickly in the game. He gets 50% off and extra replenishment on him. So the main thing with Ogres, a couple of things. So they're almost all like monstrous units, right? So monstrous infantry, monstrous cav, all of that. So they are going to be somewhat vulnerable to halberds, to spears, you know, that type of thing, potentially, if you don't maneuver them correctly. But I do think they have tools to deal with that. There are some anti-large units as well, so like the bears for Kislev. You have certain versions of the demigryphs for Empire, but you can deal with other large units pretty well with Ogres, because Ogres also have anti-large units, so that's not as big of a deal. It's just when you're up against infantry that has good anti-large, it can sometimes be a problem. But you have good anti-infantry too, like the Gorgers. It's like, yeah, those spears are getting plus 20 to large, well the Gorgers are getting like plus, you know, 20 to infantry. So they kind of even out to some extent there. I don't know why it's kind of bugging out, but anyways, so that's pretty cool. Now, they have a few different systems. They have a food system, which is each army is going to get a certain amount of foods. This is almost like Skaven food. The more you run around and kill stuff, the more food you're going to get. And then you have to have so much food, basically as an additional form of upkeep per turn. But you can also use that food, sort of like Skaven as well, to get different buffs. So before a battle, you can get extra charge bonus, extra melee attack if you want. And with Scrag, you can offer some food. I don't think the other guy has this, but you can offer some food for buffs. And these are really strong buffs. So for 10 turns, and 10 food is not that much. For 10 turns, you can get 20% extra campaign movement range. That's 30% on turn 1. I really like that. That allows you to expand and really start taking over quickly. Just hitting a new town every single turn. Whereas with a lot of factions, it might take 2 turns. If it's going to be a tough battle, you get plus 10 melee attack for your entire army, so that's huge. You need to globally recruit minus 2 turns. That's pretty big. That means a 2-turn unit you can get in 1 turn, and a 4-turn unit you could get in 2 turns. So, that's a really handy buff. He does have this thing, like big names, and again, I haven't played through this. I don't know if there are more names, or if it's just these 4. But some of these can be pretty good. It can give you extra meat if you're interested in that. But you can also get even more campaign movement, and you can get diplomacy with factions. So you can maybe get some good diplomacy with like the Norskins, and then when you're burning all of the Empire and taking over their towns, you might be able to get a trade, you know, some trade situations with the Norskins. So that could potentially be a good thing. So that's pretty cool. They have some pretty good buffs that you can get through there as well. So you do have these little Noblars. I feel like these are like really, really weak, and they are cheap money-wise, but they still cost meat. So they cost the same amount of meat as everything else, and so I think you just don't even get the Noblars. Because your other stuff is not that expensive. Like these Bull Ogres are only 125 a turn. It's like, yeah, they're a little bit more than Noblars, but I would rather just not run units. Like instead of just running like 20 units with 5 Noblars, just run 15 units and just cut the Noblars. Because they're just eating up your meat, and you can be using that meat for different things that could be useful to you. So I don't know. I've found that they're just kind of garbage. It's like, I know some people think, oh, you gotta have something to deal with the spears. How are you gonna deal with spears if you don't have Noblars? It's like, dude, just run around them. Like the ogres are really fast. Like they're 54 speed. They do really high weapon strength. They have a huge charge bonus. And they can just beat down the walls of a town. They don't even have to go through the main door. They can just go up and pound the walls. So kind of like Nakari, you can just run around the side if you want to and just beat down the doors or beat down the walls and get in there. So basically just outmaneuver the infantry spears. Spears and halberds are typically very slow units. And you can kill them with magic. And that's another thing. He has access to Flock of Doom. So I don't know if it shows it here. But you do get a hero really early on in the campaign that has Flock of Doom, and you can get it from some of your tents later on. And Flock of Doom is huge. War of Beasts is one of the best lores in the game. Flock is like just AoE guaranteed damage on everybody, and there's a bunch of other buffs that are pretty good with that as well. So, overall, really fast. Beast magic is strong. You get really good buffs like the one that I just mentioned, and there are several technologies and other things you can get that are pretty strong as well. You have really strong cavalry later on in the game. You have really good artillery that's very mobile, so you can run around and charge things with the artillery, reposition, get behind units. So very mobile artillery that's strong. Really good top-end monsters. And I think you can get to them relatively quickly. So I haven't used the camps very much, but it's kind of like horde buildings, like Black Arcs, if you play the Dark Elves, where basically it's every 20 turns you get one growth, and it's a flat amount. And there are lots and lots of technologies where you can get like one growth per turn, and you can just tech straight up to tier 3 or tier 4 even, super fast, and start getting access to those big monsters and that really strong artillery. The problem is, I don't think you can move the camps once you place them, and I believe you have to level up each individual camp. So it can take a while to do that, and it can be very expensive to do that. So you might have to globally recruit a lot of units, or mule some units over. Just recruit them with a lord, and then run and rendezvous with your other lord. So, anyways, I think that's really strong. So you can get access to high-level units. There's a great diversity of units you can get. You have, you know, different specialized ogres. You have, like I said, different artillery. You have really good monstrous cavalry. You know, just really good single entity monsters. So you kind of got it all covered. So really fast, really powerful. Doesn't have a ton of defense in terms of armor. Some of them do. You can get some of the ogres. I think they're the Iron Guts that have high defense, or high armor rather. But they all have really good HP pools, and you can get some of your lords can get really high replenishment as well. So, anyways, I think they're good. Their econ might be a little low. Their buildings don't seem to offer very much. Your main towns, you can only go up to tier 3, so you have to drop those camps everywhere. And you don't get a lot of them, though. So, again, it makes it kind of rare to be able to hire some of those high-end units. Versus Nurgle, you can get your high-end units anytime, anywhere. Right? So, it's okay. Now, I haven't tried the Ogre missions yet. I don't know how much money you get off of those. I'm assuming it's probably pretty good. You get some pretty good sack money as well. You get a big discount on the Gorgers. So those are only like 130 gold each, and they're very strong. So the Ogre units can be kind of expensive, but it just kind of is going to depend on how much money you get from sacking over time. And they seem to get pretty good sack money, and how much money those missions do. So their econ's okay. It's not as bad as some of the other ones, but it's also not fantastic. So their challenge, they don't seem to have a ton of replenishment. You do want to charge cycle the ogres a lot, so it does require some decent micromanagement. Usually their melee attack is not great. They have a great charge bonus, but if you just let them stand in combat for a long time against things with high melee defense or high armor, sometimes that can be a problem for your early units. So you got to maneuver kind of like, it's not as extreme as Nakari, but you got to move around. You got to charge cycle. Relatively tough diplomacy. I would say early on, you're going to have a lot of hostiles. You do have a pretty secure area in the mountains. It's on the edge of the map, but everyone in the Empire is going to hate you, so people are going to be flooding into you. A lot of times, your towns, I don't think, have that great of defense, although I believe you can upgrade the defenses at a reasonable cost. You know, at very specific choke points. The Empire's not going to have underway or anything like that, so you can, you know, guard specific choke points pretty well. So they're pretty good, but they have a lot of different units, some of the most diverse units out there that are actually viable. I know every faction has probably a similar amount of units technically, but I'm talking like viable units that are reasonably different from each other. I think that the Ogres have a lot of different strategic options. The missions are probably going to be pretty fun. I imagine it's like hunting down or killing different people or whatever. You get to make choices, horde choices on buildings, which I like. It forces you to specialize in certain kinds of units or approaches, has some really good min-maxing to it. Then you have the meat management, which is pretty cool. Okay. And then Mao Ying. So for the last ones, I guess I'm not going to pull it up just for the sake of time, just because I do want to cover all these and hopefully keep it under an hour. But like I said, I want to spend the most time on the top 3, then we'll go over the other ones pretty quickly. Miao Ying. So this is the lord for Cathay, that's the female one that specializes in ranged units. I think she's really strong. I think it'd be kind of fun to play as her, so hopefully we'll get that pretty soon. I did think that Cathay was going to be kind of vanilla and, like, you know, maybe boring, like, not that interesting. But they actually do have a lot of min-maxing that's pretty cool with, like, the yin and yang. And she is strong as hell, dude. If you look at her, she's got a lot of health early on. She can turn into this massive dragon, and she has really strong magic. She has life magic, which is, I think, the best magic in the game. It was arguably the best in Warhammer 2, and now with Lifeblood, the AoE healing that it gives, they've uncapped it. So it used to be capped at 4 units. Now there's no cap on it. There is a replenishment cap on all of your units, period. I don't know what it is in a battle, but, you know, just kind of like what I was talking about with Nurgle, you can just stack all of your units up if you want to, use that replenishment and heal everybody. So it's incredibly powerful. Life magic. They also changed stone form to be 60% physical resist instead of a certain amount of armor, so that's really strong in a lot of situations where you're not facing magic damage. So it's just really, really good magical buffs that she throws out there. So the Lord's really OP, and she buffs up a lot of your strongest units too. She gets 50% off of all ranged units. That includes your weapons teams. So your snipers, you get 50% off. Your kind of short-range gunner units, she gets 50% off. Doesn't include artillery, but does also include your really high-end archers that I think have pretty good armor-piercing damage, but I don't know if they have magic damage or not, although I think you can imbue them with magic damage. So, overall, really, really good fighter. She's good at face tanking. So because she has the replenishment and she can turn into a huge-ass dragon, she can protect your archers really well. You can just run her out there, you know, just throw a bunch of buffs on her, just keep the enemy busy, and then just unload on them with all of your artillery and archers if you have to. So incredibly powerful combination there. A very strong melee lord with really good supportive magic that also buffs up really strong ranged units. Cathay tends to have really good control, so there are lots of different things you can do to get public order. They have really good diplomacy with a lot of the other Cathay factions. It's a pretty defensive start position behind the Great Wall. You have very good income capabilities, not only in your main towns, but with your caravans. You do have limited occupation options, so it is kind of annoying that right next door to you there's all these chaotic wastes, but it's really hard for you to go out there and occupy it. So you're kind of stuck to just the Cathay area. The Mountains of Morn as well is a yellow area, so it's not that good for that. So it is kind of an annoying playstyle where you really just want to unify Cathay, play defensively, and just win the game through the standard story things, going into the Realms of Chaos or whatever. So it's really hard to take over the whole map in the way that you could do with Chaos, the Chaos faction. So I kind of like killing everything and taking over the map, but if you just want to, you know, play defensively, just take over a specific region and then win through the story, then she's a good way to do that. The challenge, so it's kind of classic strategies, right? Just have a good infantry line, protect your archers, that type of stuff. So there's not too much innovation there, but it is a pretty fun play style. You have pretty forgiving micro, so if you screw up a little bit, a lot of your units do have a lot of armor. You do have replenishment with her, so you can make some mistakes, unlike with Nakari and Scrag. You know, if you don't micro your units correctly, they're going to be super inefficient. You can get away with making some mistakes, probably with Mao Ying. Easy resources to manage early on. You have your, like, compass that you can use. You have your caravans you can use, which are interesting. But there's not a lot of min-maxing going on there in terms of how are you going to use your infections, how are you going to use your meat, how are you going to use your devotees. There's not as many choices as some of the other factions. That's a little bit easier. And you have a very good defensible geography early on, which makes it a bit simpler. In terms of the fun, you do have a lot of unit variety, which is pretty cool. You have an extremely powerful lord. I would say one of the most powerful lords out there. You can run into some trade drama. Are you going to get ambushed or not? Can you win this fight where you're outnumbered to protect your caravan? So I imagine there can be a lot of interesting scenarios that come up there. And there's a lot of min-maxing going on in terms of keeping your yin and yang sort of aligned. So that can be kind of interesting. It could be annoying, but it could be kind of interesting as well. Okay, then we have Kairos. So Kairos I put down a lot further than I imagine, like Legend of Total War. He seems to think that Tzeench is the best. And, you know, I disagree with that. I think that Tzeench is good, but they do definitely have some weaknesses. For someone who's supposed to be so incredibly strong with magic, I find their magic to be a little underwhelming, honestly, compared to like Nurgle or Life Magic or Beast Magic. It's okay, you know, but there's nothing crazy going on there. There aren't a lot of huge buffs for your faction. Yeah, you have like some bombardment spells, you got some wind spells, but you don't have any replenishment, which is typically the most powerful kinds of spells in my opinion, especially now that it's no longer capped at 4 units. That it's literally your entire army can be replenished by some of these spells in Life and Nurgle, and even the Ogre Magic I think has an AoE heal potentially. So Kairos is surprisingly kind of weak. I mean, not like weak, but not as strong as he should be in terms of magic. When I'm thinking strong, I'm thinking like I'm blanking on his name, but Mazda Mundi, you know, was really good because he got a lot of free spells. Like he got huge cost reductions or techless. Right, like they got huge cost reductions on a lot of their different things. They got free vortex spells, or they got a lot of diversity in their spells. Or Lord Croak, who just had like insane magic. Like that's powerful magic, right? Like Kairos, you have your baseline magic, and then you have these shards. You have to equip it, so it takes up an item slot to equip the shards to allow you to use other spells, and you can't even use a full other school of magic. It handpicks 2 spells for you, which are almost never the best spells in that school of magic. And if you equip it, it takes away some of your spells. So it's like, okay, you can give yourself a couple of things from Beast Magic, not Flock of Doom, or something like that, right? But then it's going to take away a couple of your spells. And that's just like, why, dude? That sucks. Like, make him, like, have access to a lot of spells, or free spells, or, like, something like that. Because he sucks. He's bad in combat. Like, he's all about that magic. So, it was just a little underwhelming in the fact that I think he's supposed to be, like, the best magic user, period, in Warhammer 3, or at least very, very close. But it feels to me like he's really far behind. Someone like Teclis, certainly, Mazda Mundi, Lord Croak. And I would argue, even some of these other schools of magic are just stronger. Like, Miao Ying, and just how often she can use that life magic just feels like it's going to be way better because she's good in combat and she has really good spells. And I would argue that she has way better buffs for her army, potentially. So that was a little underwhelming. You do have very strong ranged units, just spamming pink horrors and exalted pink horrors. You don't have any artillery, so you are going to be vulnerable to artillery, as, you know, all ranged infantry typically are. Okay, hang on a second, Ray. Daddy's working real quick, okay? Then we'll play.
That's a baby, Dad.
Oh, it's a baby, okay. So the barrier can help some. You know, if you get hit by stuff, you can retreat. The barrier is really strong. That's kind of the saving grace for Tzeench, is that is actually pretty good if you do hit and run stuff. Okay, Rory.
You need to put the pacifier in the baby's mouth.
Okay, okay. So that's good. You do have access to some early flying units, so that is pretty handy. Those little, I don't know what you'd call them, the stingray-looking things in the sky. Now, they're not insanely good. They are pretty good against large. So they're nice against, like, cavalry or lords that are mounted. You can surround them and do a lot of damage. So they're all right, and they're pretty good on sieges. But sieges have changed so much that you don't really need flying on sieges. As long as you have some kind of mobility, like I was talking about with the ogres or with Nakari, you can just run around and knock open different doors. So it's not like the old school sieges where flying is so good to help you clean out the ramparts. So, anyways, that's okay. You have very limited melee. You're probably going to be relying on Forsaken, which are okay in the early game if you want something that can sort of hold the line. Because your pink horrors aren't that good in combat. And they're not that fast, so they can't, like, kite and skirmish super well. They're okay. And then your lords, I think, are relatively weak. Again, in combat, they're fairly weak. They do get some bonuses to magic, and I'm sure there's some kind of cheese where you could get, like, 1,000,000 of those, you know, some kind of unit that buffs up. I forgot what it's called, but that thing that buffs up your magic intensity. I'm sure there's something like that out there that's possible. But it just seems a little underwhelming to me. So it is good. I did give them 4 stars there, basically 4 whatever crosses there. But because the pink mat horrors are strong. It not only does high base damage, but it does magic damage, and I believe it also is high piercing damage. No, it's fire. It's fire damage plus magic damage early on, which is particularly good against things like Nurgle that have regeneration and stuff like that. I still don't think that matchup is as bad. I mean, Legend and some other people make it seem like it's impossible for Nurgle to ever beat Tzeench. I kicked Tzeench's ass as Nurgle with a bunch of Nurglings before against a high-level Kairos who had like high-level knights. They were defending on a siege with towers and barriers and all this crap. And it was a tough fight. And you know what? The first time when I did it, because they had an army plus their garrison, I had to retreat, right? Because they were killing a lot of stuff, and I just retreated. But you know what? I stepped back on my property. I had 50% replenishment. I just hired to make up for the 7 units I lost. I killed maybe 12 of their units. I just hired 7 more with my global, Nurgle recruitment, had 1 million replenished back up, and went back in and sieged them again the next turn and got them. Right, and that was the only time I ever had. Every other time, I just wiped the floor with Tzeench as Nurgle. So it's not nearly as lopsided as people make it out to be if you know what you're doing with the plagues and with the Nurgle tactics. But anyways, as far as campaign management, if you get that teleport ambush, that's really strong. That's kind of a later game tech, I believe, but you can teleport directly on top of people and force an ambush. That is really nice that you have an underway plus ambush combination. Obviously very strong. You have pretty cheap buildings. Your economy seems like it's going to be pretty good. With Kairos, again, I haven't played a ton with Tzeench. I just kind of scouted it out. You can change fates, which sounds cool, but a lot of times, realistically, you're only going to be doing maybe a few of those. Like, you might do the Stop Army one, you might do some of the diplomacy stuff, but you're probably going to be doing the transfer settlements more than anything else, which can be good. So, again, we'll have to see how that works, but that could be strong if you want to try to expand a little bit faster. Now, typically, if it's something that's close to you, you can just kill it anyways. I guess the transfer can be good because you're not damaging the buildings, if it's like a high-level town or something maybe, but it's okay. It seems like you don't have very good corruption spread, right? You don't have, like, the Nakari, like, cultists everywhere. You don't have the like Kugath plague spreading plague everywhere. So it feels like it does spread a little bit slower, your corruption, than some of the other places, which means your public order is not going to be as strong. You're not going to have some of these other bonuses, so it could slow your progress a little bit. But overall, they're going to be like still really strong on the campaign. As far as challenge, I don't think it's a particularly challenging faction, right? You do have the fates where you make some decisions, but you also have really strong diplomacy, so you can kind of keep people at bay a little bit, stop them from attacking you, very similar to Nakari. And then you have a pretty easy geography. You do have the constant threat of Cathay off to the east, but I think they play pretty defensively most of the time. Off to the west, you just got the Chaos Realms and the Void, and then your early adversaries are pretty simple. I believe it's just going to be the either other Tzeench people that you might be able to play nice with if you want, or the Chaos Warriors to the north, which I think are pretty simple in the early game. Okay, last few and then we'll call it. I know over an hour is already kind of long, but okay, then we have kind of the Demons Undivided with the Prince. So this faction seems really cool, and when it first got released, a lot of people were super hype about it. I saw like some Reddit threads and stuff. They're like, nobody's ever going to play the individual Chaos Gods, because why would you when you can have everything with the Prince? The thing is, the Prince is cool, but he doesn't get the same kind of specialty and campaign management skills that a lot of the other factions get. So, like, yeah, he can get their units, but he doesn't have the same kind of strategic tools available to him. Like, he doesn't have the same level of plagues or the same level of, cultist influence or whatever it is. He's going to have the diversity of units, but his campaign management's not going to be as strong because of that. So he does get really strong gear early on. In particular, you can get this early Nurgle set of wings that gives you a Mortis Engine effect, so just like AoE damage around you, which is very strong. You can get some switchable plagues with the Rage Bars. You can get the Khorne and Nurgle combined, which I think is probably the best two to combine. which can be really strong. I'm not sure which plagues you have access to. If it's like the named plagues, especially the replenishment one, that would be super strong. But if it's just like the really basic plague, like, oh, you get egg or something with no symptoms, that's going to be pretty underwhelming. So we're going to have to see, and if it costs you money to switch them or like how that works. But if you can get the big plagues, that's going to be strong. But I don't know. I haven't gone that deep with the Prince yet. He does have access to Nurgle magic. So again, I think Nurgle is the best magic of the Chaos Gods magic, just because that regeneration, I'm telling you, is super, super strong. It's like unbelievably strong. Like, you really want Fleshy Abundance if you can get it. And then he's very versatile. You can just get a lot of different units. I do think, like I said, that Nurgle and Khorne are kind of going to be where you want to go in the early game, but I could see, getting a few other options as well. The thing is, you can get the aggression of Khorne if you want to. Just, attack people early with, like, Warriors of Chaos, and then you can also have the debuffs of the Nurgle units, the Slime Trail, and things like that from the Beasts of Nurgle, and the regeneration magic on top of that. So I think that makes for really strong melee combat force in the early game. So they have pretty weak corruption, because if you put up different buildings to worship different gods, there's going to be competing corruption in a province. And I believe he prefers Chaos Undivided corruption. So I don't think he gets penalized for other kinds of corruption, but you also don't get the benefit of the public order as much as some of the other factions do. So I think I could have that wrong, but I think that he doesn't get the public order bonuses like the other factions do, which is a huge hit. It's going to affect how fast you can expand. It's going to slow you down quite a bit. A very, very annoying geography. One of the worst geographies in the game, I think, because you're starting right in the middle of Norsca. You're potentially going to get aggression from the other Norskins, and then you have two bodies of water on either side that could also bring aggression, right? And bodies of water are the most annoying things, because people just come in and just attack your towns out of nowhere. So you're going to constantly be getting attacked by some of the Empire and the Elves from the south, and then you could also be getting it from, Khorne in the north, and then you've got all of these Norskins running around through these mountains and all this crap, and you don't have underway. So it's a really, really annoying place to have to manage in the early game. It might be best potentially just to abandon it fairly early and go take over like the far western Norskins and start from there. But yeah, it's a real pain in the ass geography, I think, in the early game. There's lots of min-maxing, so I think that that's kind of challenging. That's sort of fun as well, that you can try to figure out how you want to devote to different lords and which units you want and which equipment you want, which sets you want to pursue. Like I said, I do think it's best to probably fully commit to Nurgle, is my sense. Is going to be the strongest in terms of the sets, the set bonuses, the early magic that you get in the units you have access to. Some of it is better than natural Nurgle. The fact that you can get unlimited units, like a lot of Beasts of Nurgle early on, is very, very good. And that's a very strong unit that you don't easily have access to with Nurgle for a variety of reasons I'm not going to get into for time's sake. But you can get some units that are strong that otherwise you don't have access to. However, there are other units like the Soul Grinder you cannot get early as this guy. So Soul Grinders are tier 5 for the Demon guy. You cannot get them at tier 3 like you can with Nurgle. And you can't recruit things globally like Nurgle does. You just recruit them normally from towns, which overall I think is a lot weaker, and that takes away one of the major strengths of Nurgle. So it kind of looks like Nurgle. You get Nurgle units, but you don't have the specialty plagues, you don't have the global recruitment, and in some cases you don't have access to some of their most powerful tools in terms of getting the early Soul Grinders and all that stuff. So they are pretty strong. I think their economy is much weaker than some of the other factions. You just don't get a lot of money from most things. You have pretty low replenishment, so you're going to be punished for losing battles. I think it's pretty low replenishment overall. But fun-wise, it's probably pretty fun. You get a lot of custom gear. You can kind of check out the fashion from some of this different gear. There are going to be optimal choices eventually that you should get. So you do have a lot of options, but there's probably going to be specific things you want. And he doesn't really have a theme, right? So he doesn't have some of the funny dialogue options you get with Nakari, or some of the, just flavor of things like Nurgle, things like Nakari, things like Ogres. You're just not going to get that. It's just kind of a very vanilla vanilla faction. Okay, and then we've got Khorne. So this is probably one of the more controversial places I'm going to put this. A lot of, I think, more casual publications. I read like Rock, Paper, Shotgun had a tier list, and they had Khorne as number 1. And I think Khorne got a lot of press as being super OP. It was the first faction that most people covered. And I think that it has the potential to be very strong, but I think that its campaign management is extremely punishing if you do not do it correctly. So you have to win every fight, and you have to be turbo aggressive. So on easier difficulty levels, I think that Khorne might be a lot stronger, but once you start to get to higher difficulty levels, especially if you're not cheesing, I think it's a lot harder to potentially make that work, just because your money is so awful with Khorne. I believe, again, I've only played through a little bit of it. I haven't played a ton. But you hard snowball in the early game. You can get these extra armies if you want, which is cool, but they still cost you money. It's a reduced income, but it's still extra money. And you have to burn the town to do it, which means you're not getting income from that town. You're not getting corruption spread from that town either. Unlike Warhammer 2, where when you burn a town with chaos, it leaves behind a little beacon or something that increases the chaos in a region. It doesn't do that. You don't get anything from burned towns. So that's rough. And you don't get skulls if you do that, which you need for other technologies and other things. So, yeah, you get the bonus army, but you're burning the town, you're not getting skulls, you're not getting gold, and that's a big problem. So if you're going around and you keep burning these towns and making these extra armies, it's like, that's cool, you can burn everything around you, but then all of a sudden you have no corruption in those regions, you have no presence, you have no place to fall back to, so you can get replenishment or hire extra units, or, just whatever. Like, you have no defensible position when you get out there. So if you get into trouble, it's going to be a problem. And it can be hard with those early Khorne armies to siege, like, major towns, just because you're going to have really weak generals in those kind of fictitious armies. They don't replenish. They take damage over time. You don't have any magic. So that makes it really hard when you start running into some of these tougher opponents and these tougher tougher capitals. And if you don't get burns every couple of turns, you start dramatically deteriorating. So you have to keep winning, you have to keep fighting. So you need to have really, just decisive victories where you're not taking a lot of damage, because you're not going to be able to replenish, and it's going to completely throw your momentum off. And once you lose the momentum, it's really hard to get it back, because then you just don't have more stuff to burn because you've already burned it, right? If you have to fall back and recruit more units, that's a massive waste of time, because you have to spend all that time running back or globally recruiting, which is really expensive. You're just not establishing a presence on the map with Khorne when you're moving about. So you're getting a lot of early game power if you get those, but it's really going to hit you in that early mid game. Over time, yeah, you do get free occupations of those towns, but it's like a 10% chance early, and you can buff it up. But guess what? With like Nurgle, Nakari, all these other things, you get the town. You win, you get the town. You spread corruption, you get a defensible position. You can hire entry-level units. With Nurgle, you can hire units anywhere, anytime, and every town is potentially more soul grinders, more Forsaken, more spawn. So with Nurgle, it's insanely powerful to get a bunch of towns going. But even with Nakari, just being able to hire early demonettes, just take over a town, you took some casualties, you just hire 3 demonettes and you're good to go, right? Like, you're ready for the next battle. With Khorne, not so. So, strong melee. His lord is one of the strongest combat lords in the game. He's really OP, and if you get that chainsword item from the Khorne realm, yes, I would call that kind of cheese. But yeah, he does do a lot of damage. I know there's a lot of memes online about that, but yes, he is very strong. He can be dealt with, in some situations, but yeah, he's good. You don't have any magic, though, like I mentioned. There aren't that many debuffs you can put on the enemy to help you out. He does have good artillery, so that is nice. So he's strong in melee, but he has really good answers to ranged missile units. So that's helpful. And his units are pretty expensive early on. He does not have a lot of cheap units. Remember Nurgle, those Nurglings are like 75 gold, and they're super cost efficient. Your entry-level stuff you're going to be getting for Khorne most of the time is going to be like 175 or 200. When you're thinking about Bloodletters, you're thinking about Chaos Knights, His super early tier stuff is not that great, like the early hounds. The slightly upgraded hounds are better. I forgot what they're called, like bloodhounds or something, or 175. They're actually pretty decent, but most other stuff is going to be in that 200 plus range, which is very expensive for a faction that has a really bad economy, because you don't get that much gold from sacking or from burning stuff early on, I don't think. And again, if you're doing the strategy where you're getting a bunch of armies, you're sacrificing that potential income to do that. So it's rough. So awful economy, in my opinion, awful expansion potential, really bad corruption spread, low replenishment. However, you do have that super hard snowball. If you keep winning fights, you know, you can burn and take over a ton of the map in the early game. So it's just very dependent on how well you leverage that. He does have a really strong start in terms of his challenge, but you are hard punished. You do have really bad diplomacy, so most places will want to fight you. But you do have pretty simple map management. It's straightforward. You just kill everything that you can as fast as you can. So there aren't a lot of decisions in terms of plagues or how you're using your devotees or balancing your yin and your yang and all that stuff. It just go kill stuff. So it's pretty simple to understand. And then as far as the fun factor, you do have an OP Lord. A lot of people like that. He feels really strong when you're just running around murdering everything and burning stuff. Like it feels good. He does have like a good edgelord vibe if you like, you know, just like the hardcore chaos, murder, no prisoners, just, you know, destroy everything. This is going to be the Lord for you. So I think he can definitely be pretty fun, and we'll play him for sure. But just understand, it is going to be challenging, and I think that he's, like I said, not as strong in terms of the map management as some of the other factions. And then finally, we have Kislev. And Kislev can still be fun. I know there are people out there that like Kislev. It can be cool. I think Kislev is one of the best beginner factions, probably the best beginner faction out there, because it's pretty defensible positions. It's the most similar to Total War Warhammer 2 or a traditional Total War game. So if you're just kind of coming in and you don't understand all of the complex mechanics and you don't want to micromanage this stuff, it's pretty good. It's kind of like Empire 2.0, right, from like Warhammer 2, where for the most part you're surrounded by people that you can be friendly with through diplomacy. You can get trade agreements with them. You have common enemies with Chaos and Norskin, so when you kill those, it's going to strengthen your diplomacy. There are a couple of hostiles that are near you. There's some Skaven in the mountains. There's vampires below you. Obviously, Chaos above you. So, there's that, but it's very familiar. You have your standard, okay, we've got our archers here with heavy armor. We've got our gunners. We have, you know, just some cavalry. We've got some monsters cavalry. So, it's very similar to something like Empire. As far as the combat goes, they're okay. The thing is, you don't have a lot of stuff in terms of the map management that's going to help you out. There are a couple of buffs you can get, but I think they're tier 3, and that's where most factions really get strong, is they have something at tier 3 that's really good, whether it's artillery or some kind of, you know, cavalry that's really devastating. There's something at tier 3, right, that's strong for most factions, right? Like you've got your the artillery for Khorne. That's really good at tier 3. You have the exalted bloodletters at tier 3. When you think about Kugath, you can get your grinders at tier 3. Get your, you know, your chaos spawn at tier 3. So that's really strong. Nakari, that's where you get your demonettes. That's where you start to get some pretty good skirmisher cav. When you have Scrag, that's where you get your artillery, Iron Guts. You know, so some of the other ogres that are pretty good. Miao Yang, that's where, I can't remember what she specifically gets at tier 3. Oh, you get your weapons teams, which are pretty good. I don't remember if you get your artillery at tier 3 or not, but those weapons teams are really nice, the snipers. You know, so like most factions are going to have something good at tier 3, but it just feels like Catarins are a little on the weak side. Your tier 4 is good. That's where you get Little Grom, which is a good artillery piece. That's where you get your Bear Riders, which are really good cavalry superiority units. You get your Ice Guard at tier 4, which are like pretty good hybrid units. So you get some good stuff at tier 4. The problem is there is a massive difference between tier 3 and tier 4. It takes way more time to get a town to tier 4. and especially because a lot of your important provinces, like your starting province in Kislev, is just a one-town province with 10 building slots, it's really hard to get enough growth, right? Because growth is way easier with something like a Nurgle faction early, where you have 4 different towns where you can build a growth building in all of them to power up your town. So it's really hard to grow. Your tier 3 is not great early. I think your magic, I think the frost magic is pretty weak in the early game. I don't remember what the alternative magic was, but it also did not strike me as being particularly strong compared to like life magic, beast magic, Nurgle magic. Didn't seem that great. I think that Catherine herself is pretty weak in the early game. She does have some buffs that are alright, but she's not that great in combat. When she gets on the bears, she gets a little bit better. But overall, a pretty weak lord when you compare her to, you know, something like Scarbrand or Nakari or even Kugath. You know, all of these factions are going to be a little bit stronger. I should have named that Scarbrand. And then you don't have a lot of magical attacks in your army, which is a big deal because most demons have physical resist. So they're going to be very resilient to your attacks. When I just absolutely slammed Catarine's armies. Just battles I had no business winning with Nurgle because they just don't have magic attacks. We had Nurglings like swarming bears and killing them, right? Like 150 gold worth of Nurglings just beating up on this bear that's like 450 gold each. Like this tier 4 unit getting like jacked by zombies just because they can't like break through the physical resist and the high melee defense. So it's just really hard to deal with demons if you don't have those magical attacks. Now some of them do. You know, your Ice Guard does have magical attacks, I believe, but a lot of your units do not have magical attacks, unlike some of the other factions out there. So that's kind of rough. But you do have really good armor, so that is going to, you know, allow you to stomp some of the Norskins specifically that aren't going to have a ton of armor piercing most of the time in the early game. So she can be good, but those are definitely problems compared to some of the other factions. You do have pretty good control with her in the early game. Nice public order, so you can expand pretty quickly. You do have some of the different motherland bonuses you can get. You do have the training, which again I haven't tried a lot, but you can, you know, get some high level wards, high level heroes in the early game, which is good. So she does have some pretty solid campaign management. I think she lowers corruption a lot, so that's handy. She can't occupy corrupt territories though, so you want to fight corruption, but you can't occupy it very easily. So that's kind of annoying. The mountains are probably yellow. I don't know for sure, but that's kind of the same problem as Cathay. Is you're sort of boxed into this one region that you can fight really well. But you can't expand and like take over the world very easily, like some of the chaos. So that's going to limit a little bit of the fun factor for me. So you really want to win through the storyline with Kislev and just kind of play a defensive style. So you're near a bunch of allies, relatively simple choices with some of the mechanics in there. It's very familiar to other Total War factions. So what about the fun factor? Well, bears are cool. Everybody likes bears. They have some fun mounts. But I think they're a little bit basic in the theme, just your standard sort of do-gooder, you know, let's go save this bear. So it's okay. It's just, again, it's kind of basic. It just plays on a lot of kind of the humans in fantasy realms tropes. Like, they're very somber, serious. There's not a lot of fun or, like, really unique or interesting kind of events or personalities, I think, that they deal with. So they just kind of feel sort of cookie cutter to me in terms of the theme and some of their mechanics. So it is fine. Like, it's good. It's interesting. It's just not as much fun as something like Nakari, who's just weirdness, you know, adds a lot of levity to the game. You know, something like Kugath, who's just sort of weird and interesting and just kind of grotesque. So I just don't think there's as much, like, personality and vibe and, like, interesting new mechanics with them as some of the other ones. But overall, like I said, they can definitely be really fun, and we're definitely going to play them. So, okay, that's it. Really long, in-depth tier list, but I really wanted to give you guys not just a sense of this is good or this is bad, because, again, all of the factions can be fun. You can be successful. Every faction can win versus every other faction. Even things that, you know, are commonly thought to be bad matchups, like Nurgle and Tzeench, is definitely winnable most of the time. So, Go out there, have some fun, play with something that resonates with you. Check out my campaigns. Like I said, right now I'm doing Nurgle and Slaanesh. I'm going to have guides for Nurgle and Slaanesh as well. And then we're eventually going to do playthroughs of all the other factions. I'll do 2 or 3 at once. They should have Immortal Empires out. I believe they didn't give us an exact timeline, but estimates are maybe 2 or 3 months where you get the really big map. And they're going to be, I think, probably reimagining a lot of the other factions to some extent. They're going to be making the secondary town sieges. I think they're probably going to be using the Rift system. Now, I doubt you're going to go fight the Chaos Gods there, but you might be able to use the Rifts in order to teleport around the map. I think that would be fantastic. So then you could actually, warp somewhere else and, take over some new geographies. So that does seem very interesting. And then I think there are going to be a lot of legendary lords they're going to be adding that are going to be bringing probably some fun new mechanics as well for some of the Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 factions. So I really look forward to it. I think it's going to be fantastic. And of course, we're going to keep cranking the campaigns the whole way. So that's going to be it. Let me know what you think. Which ones do you think are powerful? Which ones are you having the most fun with so far? And stay tuned for the rest of the content. And I'll see you next time. Have a good day.